On February 29, 1944, American troops began landing on the island of Iwa as soon as it became known that the large forces of the enemy fleet are bombarding the yard in the Prime. As torpedo carriers, it included submarines I-368, I-370 and I-44. The detachment went to the area of Ivozdima Island on February 22nd, Ivozdima on February 22nd. February 25th, on the approach to the island, submarine I-370 was sunk by an American destroyer, and on February 26th, in the same area in the aircraft carrier of the enemy sank the submarine I-368. The third boat I-44 reached Iwo Jima, but being detected by the U.S. destroyer, was forced to dive and stayed underwater for about 46 hours. There was no attack by depth bombs, but conditions in the boat became terrible. The air contained over 6% carbon dioxide, and the men were on the verge of suffocation. Eventually, the boat commander was forced to abandon the operation and return to base. The commander of the submarine forces, learning of this, became furious and immediately dismissed the commander. So, the operation of the detachment Tibaya ended in complete failure. A new squad of human torpedoes was formed, named Kamitake. The squad, which included my boat I-58 and boat I-36, was assigned the task of attacking the enemy in the area of the island of Iwo Jima and inflict losses on him. Iwo Jima and inflict on him losses, however small. On March 1, 1945, when the boat I-58 was leaving Kure, we were given a warm send-off. Having passed the Bungo Strait, we were already in Tosa Bay at dusk, but a typhoon was approaching, and to avoid meeting it, all the next day the boat went at full speed in a surface position. The reason for the failure of the detachment Tibaya remained unclear, but after careful consideration, we decided to approach the island of Iwo Jima from the north, where the enemy kept watch not particularly carefully. The enemy had concentrated his surveillance to the south and east of the island, where his lines of communications passed. It was to be expected that we would discover many ships and other targets in this area, but orders forbade us to attack the enemy, for our main task was to attack ships at anchor. The southern route of approach to the island was unacceptable to us. At night on March 3 and 4, the radar station detected enemy planes, so we had to follow in an underwater position. The boat was fitted with a shortwave antenna of the latest type, the results of which were excellent. As far as the situation allowed, we followed in a surface position both day and night and dived only when absolutely necessary. On diving on March 4th, we heard noises similar to those of anti-submarine ships. On the night of March 5th, for 2 HRs, the same thing was observed. However, nothing bad happened. On March 5th, on medium waves, we intercepted a radio-telephone conversation between the ships involved in the bombardment of Iwo Jima Island. This indicated that the enemy had engaged large formations of large surface ships. On March 6th, we went underwater for a day and began to approach the target, taking all precautions. About 4 p.m., we heard the sound of 4 successive explosions, and at the same moment the noise of the propellers was clearly heard, which soon became silent. About an hour before sunset, we swam up to periscope depth to look around, and soon noticed a large enemy ship. We immediately withdrew to deep water, without even determining its class. The fact was that if this ship was anchored, it would take about an hour of time to approach it, and the boat's batteries were dead if the ship was moving. It could not be a target for manned torpedoes. After charging the batteries, we headed for the most favorable area to make a successful attack with the manned torpedoes. The boat's crew was very unhappy that we had left the enemy alone instead of attacking him. However, the human torpedoes were designed to attack enemy ships at anchor, so we had no other choice. After sunset, we prepared to surface, but suddenly heard the noise of propellers, and since visibility was poor, remained underwater. On March 7th, long before sunrise, we surfaced to recharge our batteries. The northern part of the island. Iwo Jima was already looming on the radar screen. The sea was calm. The night was dark and moonless. Before sunrise, we loaded. The final phase of the approach to the island began. The same day after sunset, we surfaced and made final preparations for the release of manned torpedoes. At dinner, according to custom, we said goodbye to the torpedo drivers, explaining the situation. It was decided to begin the release of torpedoes on March 8th early in the morning. At 2300 hours, having finished charging the batteries, We proceeded on a 15-knot run in a surface position to an area 17 miles northwest of Iwo Jima Island, where we intended to arrive at 2 o'clock. During the crossing, torrents of rain fell upon the boat several times. Visibility was poor, which favored the action of manned torpedoes. With the help of our radar station was detected the work of enemy radar stations, conducted from 3 directions, indicating the possible presence of destroyer squadrons in the area. We decided, if they detected us, to go underwater. The torpedo drivers, who were to take their places from the upper deck of the boat, were ready to do so at short notice, but as it was still 3 hours before they could be launched, we gave them liquor to keep them warm. After another hour, already on the approach to Iwo Jima Island, a very urgent radiogram was unexpectedly received which read, Kamitaike Squadron's operation is cancelled. Submarine I-58 should immediately proceed to the area of Iwo Jima Island. Okinoshima to participate as a floating radio station in the United Fleet operation. The operation will be conducted on March 11th. It was madness to turn back, being so close to the enemy. I could hardly get over the whole thing. Contacting headquarters was out of the question. We could be detected immediately. While I was weighing the possibility of releasing human torpedoes, before proceeding to execute the last order, was received a second, now personal radiogram from the Chief of Staff of the United Fleet, which stated Operation A is very important in its significance. So the order given to your submarine must be strictly implemented. Report the route and approximate time of departure to the area of Okinoshima Island. Okinoshima, there was nothing left for us to do but obey the order. I immediately reported it to the boat crew and torpedo drivers. On March 9th, we loaded in the morning, and in the evening we dropped torpedoes overboard and headed full speed in a surface position to the area of Okinoshima. It was very unfortunate that we could not seize the opportunity for attack which was afforded us on March 8th. On the way we twice detected enemy aircraft which forced us to go underwater for about an hour on each occasion. During the rest of the time we proceeded in a surface position at a speed of 14 knots. Finally, as it was calculated, we sighted the island of Okinoshima. Having accomplished our task, we returned to Kure. I immediately reported my arrival to the commander. In the course of the report, I pointed out that we would have been able to release manned torpedoes in the attack if another submarine had been sent to the Okinoshima area instead of our boat. One of the senior staff officers told me that they had no idea that we had such a successful operation. It is hard to say what might have happened to us after we would have fired our torpedoes, as there were enemy destroyers around us at the time. Maybe we would have perished, but I still wanted to make such an attempt. During this operation, the new radar station worked much more reliably, but still needed further testing to perfect it. The submarine I-36 left the base 1 day later than we did. After passing Bungo Strait and receiving orders to cancel the operation, she was forced to return to base. On March 24, 1944, the American task force began shelling the southern coast of Okinawa Island. Okinawa, so our submarines were ordered to go to the area. The boats I-8, Row 41 and Row 46 that went out there to search for the enemy were sunk. The enemy created an insurmountable anti-submarine defense, as he had in this area complete domination at sea and in the air. Despite this, a new detachment was formed, named Tatara, which included submarines I-47, I-56, I-58 and I-44. Each of these boats had 6 reconstructed manned torpedoes. The submarine I-47 entered the Okinawa area on March 29th. After she had safely passed the Bungo Strait, she was suddenly attacked by a group of enemy aircraft numbering over 50, which were mistaken by the boat for her own. This happened off Cape Miyazaki. The boat urgently dived and began to evade pursuit. More than 30 bombs were dropped on her, which however did not damage her. Half an hour later, the boat surfaced and continued southward. The next morning at 2:30 a.m., 2 warships were sighted, the distance to which was about 5,400 meters. The observer reported that they were cruisers, so having submerged, the submarine prepared to attack, but further periscope observation showed that they were destroyer squadrons. It was too late to do anything about it, and the submarine was attacked by depth bombs. Eventually, in the vicinity of Taniga Island, she managed to break away from the enemy. After sunset, she surfaced to investigate the causes of fuel leaks from the fuel tanks. Unexpectedly, she was again attacked by enemy aircraft. After an emergency dive of the boat, a bomb that exploded nearby further increased the fuel leakage, so she had to return to Kure. The other two submarines, I-56 and I-44, left the base on April 3rd, and there has been no news of them since. After the war, we heard that both of these boats were sunk by American destroyers off Okinawa Island. Our boat I-58 left the base on April 2nd, having on board the same torpedo drivers who had been with us on our ill-fated trip to Iwo Jima Island. The operation plan was flexible, and its fulfillment depended on the disposition of enemy ships. I asked the headquarters to provide me with detailed information regarding the deployment of ships near the island of Okinawa and the peculiarities of the search groups of destroyers in the northern part of the island. As usual, we passed the Bungo Strait in the dark, carefully observing all precautions. On the afternoon of April 2nd, we loaded and continued on our way southward. During the ensuing night, there was heavy cloud cover which greatly impaired visibility. On April 2nd and 3, trying to evade enemy air attacks, we safely reached Yaku Island. Tentatively, we decided to approach the target from the west, but in view of the fact that Tyudzi Bay was already in the hands of the enemy, the approach from the eastern side could be safer. In the end, we still decided to approach from the west side, as this option promised us an encounter with enemy ships anchored at anchor and a good target for our manned torpedoes. Deep in the night of April 3rd, we began to approach the enemy. Suddenly, in the center of the strait, we detected a target that resembled a submarine in a surface position and immediately made a dive, but after about an hour, having lost contact with the detected boat, surfaced and following a zigzag, continued on their way. The next 24 hours during daylight hours we had to go underwater, as radar indicated the presence of aircraft nearby. During April 5th and 6th we had to dive at least 7 times. We had no means of determining whether they were our own or enemy planes. These delays threw us off schedule, and it was not until April 6th that we reached the area west of the Amami Islands, at about 1 p.m. 00 min. We spotted a mast on the horizon, and upon submerging we determined that it was a small anti-submarine ship. However, it was not possible to know for certain whether it was our own or an enemy ship. As the area of fighting approached Japanese waters, it was easy to mistake enemy ships or planes for their own. The weather began to deteriorate. Low black clouds hovered over the sea. The excitement increased. We began to worry about whether we would be able to fire our manned torpedoes. We hoped that the weather would be more favorable in the area of the anchorage at Okinawa Island. Our course to the island was far from the coast, so in bad weather it was very difficult to accurately determine our position. The radar range was insufficient to detect nearby islands. In view of the fact that day and night we were disturbed by aviation, we did not have enough time to charge the batteries. In such a situation, the appearance of even one destroyer was a mortal danger to us. On April 7th, conditions did not improve, and we were very little time on the surface. The boat's location was still determined only by calculus. The current further aggravated our situation as its speed was 2 knots. On the same day, April 7th, we learned that the line ship Yamato was to join our forces fighting off Okinawa Island. It was good to know that we would participate in battles together with this ship. In reality, Yamato was already sunk. On April 8th, a radiogram was received from the commander of the United Fleet, which contained an order to engage and fight to the death. We surfaced, determined to go straight to the target. Later in the afternoon, a large patrol plane appeared above us. The enemy used such machines to fight submarines. Almost losing all hope of rescue, we made an emergency dive, but to our surprise, the plane did not attack us. Nevertheless, we continued to remain in an underwater position during daylight hours. Since the enemy was sending out an aerial patrol during the night, we could not surface and recharge our batteries. If this continued, we would not be able to carry out even one attack with empty batteries. We decided to surface for a short time and recharge the batteries, and then wait for the weather to improve before making a second attempt to approach the target. Eventually, we turned back toward Kyushu Island. When we clarified our position, it turned out that our error of reckoning amounted to 45 miles. The boat set course for Okinawa Island again. The weather was even worse than before. Besides, day and night we were disturbed by enemy aviation. We had no respite to recharge our batteries. It was evident from everything that we had the same difficulties ahead of us as before. On April 14th, we suddenly received orders to head for the Pacific Ocean. On the way, we were first of all to overcome our own minefields, then to head for the coast of China, and finally, following the coast of Formosa, to reach the Pacific. Prior to this, we had spent at least 7 days trying to attack enemy ships in the vicinity of Okinawa Island. But due to bad weather, all these attempts were unsuccessful. During these actions, we were attacked by enemy aircraft over 50 times. The longest time we managed to stay on the surface was less than 4 hours. And on the 2 days when we were closest to Okinawa, the longest period our boat stayed on the surface was 1 hour 10 minutes. The boat's radar station was unreliable at that time, and we were exposed to enemy aircraft attack for 2 to 3 min. After surfacing, it usually took 4 to 5 HRS to charge the boat batteries and 6 HRs to fully charge them. One charge of high-pressure air cylinders is enough to ensure 3 to 4 surfacing of the boat. It takes 30 min to fully charge the air cylinders. We have experienced firsthand that in severe conditions it can happen that the boat will not have high-pressure air and will not be able to float regardless of the degree of charging of the batteries. A single destroyer chasing a boat for 1 day may exhaust her half-charged batteries to such an extent that she will be unable to move. It should be borne in mind that submarines carrying manned torpedoes had no artillery armament, so surfacing to fight with the pursuing ship was not feasible, since the entire armament of the boat consisted of 2 machine guns. The use of manned torpedoes in the stormy weather then prevailing was impossible. We entered the Pacific Ocean from the east coast of Formosa and set a course northward, being from Okinawa Island at a distance of 300 to 400 miles. Okinawa at a distance of 300 to 400 miles. We met no enemy along the way except for one occasional airplane. On April 25th at about 1 a.m., while proceeding in a surface position, we received contact on the surface target detection station indicator. The sea was calm and a light breeze was blowing. We immediately submerged and waited. Soon through the periscope we saw a ship coming with navigation lights on. It turned out to be a hospital ship, so we missed it. At about 3 a.m. at 00 min, we heard the sounds of 9 consecutive explosions. Keeping a periscope observation, we managed to spot 1 or 2 masts on the horizon. Soon we saw 3 ships. At first we took them for cruisers, but then it turned out that they were small destroyers. While we were studying the situation, the enemy ships headed in our direction. Could they have detected us? It was impossible to release the manned torpedoes, as their condition had not been checked since the boat left the base, that is, more than a month. We had to leave. We had no other choice. We dived to a depth of 82 meters. There was silence in all compartments of the boat. Half an hour later, we heard the noise of 3 ships' propellers. Undoubtedly, we had finally been discovered. The only thing left for us to do was to keep quiet. The boat's crew took up their posts according to the survivability schedule. The noise of the propellers was increasing. One of the ships passed directly over the boat from stern to bow, a second from starboard and a third from port. We waited for the attack, and there was a sepulchral silence in the boat. Tension was reaching its extreme limits. To our surprise and relief, the enemy ships passed over us and began to move away. Then there was an explosion of 1 depth bomb, but by this time the destroyers were already far away from us. The enemy was not as formidable as we had anticipated. We lay down on the opposite course from the direction of the explosion and went a considerable distance away, but believed that we were still on the enemy's line of communications. Unfortunately, we received orders to return and came to base on April 29th. On crossing to the base not far from the boat, an enemy mine exploded. Many fish surfaced from the explosion, which helped us to celebrate the Emperor's birthday properly. Upon arrival in Kure, we learned that none of the other submarines that had gone out to Okinawa Island had returned to base. The submarine Row 109 reported that she had been attacked by enemy ships which had dropped at least 300 depth bombs. She was ordered to return to base, but never did. Consequently, the only submarine to return from this operation was I-58. A meeting was called to discuss the operation as it related to the actions of submarines I-56 and Row 109. As a result of the work of this meeting, it was felt that it was futile to attempt to penetrate the heavily defended bases of the landed enemy. The only place where we could count on success in the current situation was when acting on the lines of communication. The Okinawa campaign was not the first time this problem had arisen, but now only 4 of the large submarines survived, and it was decided to equip the I-300 transport submarine to carry human torpedoes. After the war, we learned that the other submarines involved in the fighting off Okinawa were sunk by American destroyers east and southeast of that island. One of the surviving crew members of the submarine I-8 describes the event as follows. On March 30th at about 23 HIs, 30 min. The observer detected an approaching enemy destroyer, so the boat made an emergency dive. The first bomb bursts followed when the boat was at a depth of about 28 meters. Then the boat was bombed for 4 hours. And finally sank her. The enemy dropped depth bombs very accurately, as he could easily locate the boat by the noise of its propellers. The intensity of the attacks was increasing. As a result of the explosions, there was a hole in the aft personnel room, where water began to enter after that. We did everything we could to plug the hole, but in vain. The boat was diving with a 25-deg stern trim, as a result of which the water in the hold began to accumulate in the stern. The depth of the dive reached 137 meters. Something had to be done, and the boat commander ordered the stern tanks to be blown out. As a result of blowing, air bubbles reached the surface and well marked the enemy target. We stood at battle stations and expected to die. The entire stock of torpedoes was used up and the boat commander decided to surface and take the fight. The order was given to blow out the main ballast tanks. The boat's batteries were completely discharged. On March 31st at about 2:00, 00 min. I, being one of the gun crew, stood in the deckhouse of the boat surfacing at an angle of 20 deg. When the hatches were peeled off and we jumped out on the deck, there was an enemy destroyer on our starboard side, on which we opened fire from 25 mm cannon. Not having time to load the 140 mm cannon together with another crewman, I was wounded in the leg by a shell fragment. I tried to get to the bridge, but at that moment an enemy shell hit it, creating a big hole in it. Trying to reach the machine gun again, I saw an enemy cruiser approaching. Our boat, shelled by 2 enemy ships from a distance of about 2750 meters, had little chance for salvation. It soon capsized and sank. It was at 2:30 a.m. I found myself in the water. My leg was very sore, but I still managed to stay on the surface. There was another person swimming next to me, but I could not see his face. The wind was blowing quite fresh, and there was a strong dead ripple on the sea, illuminated by the pale light of the moon. After 2 hours in the water, I came to my senses already in the infirmary of the American destroyer squadron. Of the 5 submarines carrying human torpedoes, which carried out attacks in the area of Iwo Jima Island. Iwo Jima, 2 boats were lost. In the vicinity of the island, the same fate befell 2 of the 4 submarines that took part in the operation. And those boats that returned safely to the base were unable to fire a single manned torpedo. In fact, this kind of attack against heavily defended enemy anchorages was ineffective. Therefore, it became necessary to attack moving enemy ships, that is, on their passage by sea. Human torpedo carrier submarines were equipped in such a way that torpedo drivers could be seated in them from inside the boats in an underwater position. The number of torpedoes attached to the boats was increased. The submarines I-47 and I-36, part of the Amatake detachment, left the base on April 12th and 20, respectively, to conduct the first attack on moving ships. 8 of the 12 available manned torpedoes were fired, each targeting a transport or destroyer. When practicing attacks on a moving ship, 2 to 3 torpedo launches were not enough. For normal mastery of this technique required at least 6 training releases. On May 5th, submarine I-367 left the base and east of Okinawa Island. Okinawa, with 2 of its 5 manned torpedoes, sunk 2 enemy ships, the type of which is not identified. Submarine I-361 patrolled in the vicinity of Okinawa Island during the period from May 23rd to May 23rd. Okinawa from May 23rd to June 15th did not return to base. Submarine I-363 was ordered to attack enemy ships on the line of communication linking Okinawa Island with the Yukinoa Island. Okinawa and Ulithi Islands, but failing to find a target, returned to base without firing any of her manned torpedoes. Submarine I-165 entered the Mariana Islands area, but did not return to base. The submarine I-36 came under heavy enemy attack while on patrol, but survived. This boat left the base on June 6th and headed for the Mariana Islands. During the trip it was discovered that all of its manned torpedoes were defective. The submarine personnel managed to fix 3 torpedoes out of 6. In the Saipan area, the boat detected a merchant ship and fired 1 torpedo, but the ship was alert and evaded the attack. The boat pursued this vessel for an hour and a half, but suddenly showed a destroyer, the distance to which was no more than 900 meters. The commander hastily removed the periscope, but immediately over the boat exploded 2 depth bombs, which knocked out the steering control of the boat. Half an hour later, the destroyer squadron returned to the area where the boat was located and resumed attacks, passing over it 4 times. The torpedo drivers asked permission to release. The order to release was given, but it turned out that the torpedoes did not operate the electric steering actuators. In addition, the torpedo driver's telephone communication with the boat had been cut off. The commander cancelled the release order. At this time, another destroyer squadron approached and took part in the attacks of the boat. This circumstance might have rendered the torpedoes useless, and so 2 of them were fired. 20 minutes later, a violent explosion was heard. It was a new series of depth bombs bursting. In order to evade the attacks, the submarine sank even deeper. After 2 days underwater, she finally surfaced. There was no enemy nearby. The boat's batteries were completely drained, with only enough high-pressure air left for one resurfacing. Nevertheless, she managed to return to Cure on June 30th. In 1942, it was decided to build 18 large submarines, each of which was capable of taking on board 3 aircraft torpedo carriers. There was a rumor that the testing of the aircraft to go into service with these boats was nearing completion. However, while waiting for the boats to be completed, the military situation continued to deteriorate. In December 1944, the first submarine of this type, i.e. the I-400, was completed, and in January 1945, the I-401 was expected to be completed. In addition, the submarines I-13 and I-14 were converted for the same purpose, which could take 2 airplanes each. The conversions were completed in January and February 1945, respectively. All 4 submarines were consolidated into one detachment, with Capt. 2nd Rank Arizumi appointed as commander. Partial trials were begun in the inner sea of Japan area. The boats were intended to carry out the operation to bomb the Panama Canal, but the planes that were supposed to arm the boats were not yet ready. So working out the tasks of releasing them from the boats, then, was still impossible, and it was possible to implement it only at the end of April 1945. In the process of working out, there were various failures. For example, the boat I-401 hit a mine, and the release of the squadron to fulfill the task was delayed. Planning for the operation was coming to an end. The range of submarines type I-400 was equal to 40,000 miles, so that the fuel reserves were enough for the voyage to Panama and back. Converted boats type I-13 had a shorter range, so replenishment of their fuel at sea had to be made by boats type I-400. Both types of boats were to take a 4-month supply of food. In total, it was supposed to take 10 aircraft, of which 6 were armed with torpedoes, the remaining 4 bombs. The operation plan provided for 2 strikes on the canal locks in one place in order to completely destroy them. While practicing the tasks, a mock-up of the locks was made, on which multiple training bombing raids were conducted. At the end of June, training exercises were conducted with each individual aircraft, during which 2 machines crashed. Meanwhile, the situation continued to deteriorate. Heavy air raids on the territory of Japan proper began, which were presumably preparations for the landing of paratroopers. In the Sea of Japan, an American submarine attacked our submarine I-122, and soon it became impossible to find a safe place to practice training tasks. Under the created situation, it was not at all to conduct an operation against the distant Panama Canal. Since there was an urgent need for submarines to strike at enemy aircraft carriers anchored off Ulithi Islands and in the Mandate Territory, it was decided to send boats I-14 and I-13 in Truk to conduct air reconnaissance in the area of Ulithi Islands by the airplanes based on them. These boats each had 2 of the latest Iagumos-type reconnaissance planes. On June 15th, both boats left Ominato, and the next morning the boat I-13 was sunk by a U.S. aircraft carrier aircraft. Submarine I-14 arrived safely in Truk. Following her, there were also sent boats I-400 and I-401. The plan to strike the Panama Canal was revised. Aircraft boats I-400 and I-401 first had to make a raid on Ulithi Islands, and then the boats, after receiving back their planes, were to head to the Panama Canal area. The Ulithi raid was scheduled for August 25th. In early August, the submarines I-400 and I-401 left Truk for this mission, but the war ended on August 16th. The said two boats of 3,500 tons displacement each never achieved any combat successes. They were the world's largest submarines. 3 years of planning and design had gone to waste. The squadron commander, Captain Second Rank Arizumi, shot himself before arriving in Yokosuka in late August 1945. In 1946, the boats I-400 and I-401 were taken back to the United States by the Americans. The third boat of this type, I-402, was completed shortly before the end of the war. During construction, she was converted into a submarine tanker. In July 1945, the submarine I-58 was again ready for combat missions. We received an order on July 16th to leave Kure and head for action on the enemy's lines of communication. To the sound of marching and cheers of the seeing off, we left the harbour and went to the trawled fairway. One night we spent at the base of manned torpedoes, where a special ceremony was held in honour of torpedo drivers. We had 6 such brave men on board. The next morning we went to sea accompanied by 24 motorboats. At the entrance to the Bungo Strait we conducted test deep-sea dives. During the tests it became clear that the periscopes on the torpedoes were defective, and we had to return to base to replace them. Finally, on the morning of July 18th, we put to sea again and headed south through Bungo Strait, zigzagging at full speed because we feared enemy submarine attacks. A submarine in a surface position has no means of dealing with enemy boats in a submerged position. The only thing it can do is to increase its course. When the submarine has radar stations for detecting air and surface targets, it can detect the enemy, determine its position and course, and thereby avoid encountering it. With the onset of daylight, enemy submarines went underwater, and we did the same. At night we surfaced and repeated the old cat and mouse game. Thus it is sometimes possible to pass through the waters where enemy submarines hide in ambushes. Sometimes, therefore, and we were able to pass at full speed in a surface position to the enemy's lines of communication. That night our radar station detected a group of American airplanes type B-29, flying, probably, to strike at the territory of Japan. What city would these airplanes bomb this time? The moon began to shine brighter, and we had already reached the line of communications linking Saipan and Okinawa, where we could well expect to meet the enemy. As usual at dinner we drank to the impending success of the torpedo drivers. I explained to them the general situation. According to the order we received, we were to attack enemy ships off the east coast of the Philippines. The submarine I-53 came out with us and was to patrol east of Okinawa. Nothing was visible on the surface except the vast expanse of ocean. We decided to wait for the enemy at the point where the communication routes from his main bases on Leyte, Saipan, Okinawa, Guam, Palau and Ulithi converged. But we were well aware that even so we might not encounter the enemy in such a vast area. Having manned torpedoes, we were determined to sink any ship that met in our path. On the line of communications linking Okinawa and Saipan, the sea, illuminated by the bright moonlight, was calm, and conditions were excellent for carrying out the attack, but no enemy appeared. We were also unlucky on the Okinawa-Guam line of communication. July 22nd was a full moon. With favourable conditions for attacking both day and night, we headed for the Leyte Guam line of communications. The moon was gradually waning, the chances of carrying out an attack were disappearing, and I prayed to God to give us the opportunity. On July 27th, in accordance with orders, we approached the enemy's Guam-Leyte line of communications and headed west along it. On July 28th at 5 o'clock, 30 min. With the help of radar station was detected aircraft, and we immediately dived. It must be said that by this time our radar equipment was much more advanced, and we were no longer afraid of being taken by surprise by enemy aircraft. At 14 o'clock, we surfaced to periscope depth and, to my great joy, discovered a 3-masted vessel slowly approaching. It turned out to be a large tanker. At last we were face to face with the elusive enemy, who appeared to be unaware of our presence. While we were watching the tanker, a destroyer appeared within sight, which made matters much more difficult. We dived to get closer, and I gave 2 orders. Torpedo drivers, prepare to attack and prepare to fire all torpedo tubes. Our noise detectors were not working well. It would be unwise of us to approach the enemy to the distance of a torpedo salvo, not knowing where the destroyer was. Based on the situation, I decided to use human torpedoes and gave the order, 1st and 2nd torpedoes. Stand by. The driver of the 1st torpedo was a little hesitant, so I decided to fire the 2nd torpedo first. By telephone, I informed both drivers of the enemy's course and speed. At 14 hours, 31 minutes, the driver of Torpedo No. 2 started the engine and reported his readiness to fire. Following this, I gave the order for its release. The last fastener was given and the Torpedo raced toward the enemy tanker. 10 minutes later, Torpedo No. 1 was ready to be fired. Its driver shouted, "Long live the Emperor," and she separated from the boat. Both torpedoes seemed to be going well. The usual squall for the southern seas was passing by, but we could still see the tanker. No explosions were heard for a long time. With concern, I continued to watch through the periscope. Finally, the tanker disappeared from sight. After about 50 minutes, after the release of Torpedo No. 2 heard the first explosion, and 10 minutes later the second, we surfaced, but a new squall enveloped everything around us, making it impossible to see anything. We thought about the people who had been with us recently. We prayed for them and wished them happiness in the other world. It was the 10th day since we had left Cure, and our supply of fresh vegetables had run out. We had a few heads of onions left, and otherwise from morning till evening we had to make do with canned food, which we were sick of, especially canned sweet potatoes, the taste of which left much to be desired. Continuing our search for the enemy, we proceeded to the junction of his communications between Leyte to Guam and Palau to Okinawa. On July 29th, the weather was mostly bad all day, but without a storm, so we continued to proceed to the objective in a surface position. We now relied entirely on our 4 large binoculars and radar stations and trusted that we would detect the enemy before he detected us. We feared only enemy submarines in good visibility. Both the crew of our boat and its armament were first class. Had the Japanese boats had radar 2 years ago, we would not have suffered such heavy losses. I believed that we could continue in a surface position, but the visibility deteriorated and by 7 p.m., it was almost zero. It was almost zero. We dived, deciding to wait for moonrise, which was due at 2200 hours. After diving, the boat mechanic came up to me and asked how long we intended to stay underwater. He needed to make some minor repairs, which it was not possible to do in a surface position with continuous running. He was greatly relieved to learn that he had about 2 hours to do so. Having given orders to wake me up at 2200 hours. 30 minutes, I went to rest in the wardroom. The boat, at a speed of 2 knots, was moving in a westerly direction. In the dimly lit boat, nothing disturbed the silence, except for the faint sounds of the air conditioning unit running and the characteristic sounds of the horizontal and vertical rudders moving. 2/3 of the boat's personnel were resting. People slept completely naked on bunks, on torpedoes and on sacks of rice. The rest of the personnel were on watch or were busy with repairs in the diesel compartment. There were a lot of rats on the boat. They were a real scourge, impossible to get rid of. The rats fiddled around in the galley. Their fiddling was annoying. At 10:30 p.m., the petty officer on watch woke me up and reported that everything was in order. I put on my uniform, went into the ship's prayer room, and then went up to the deckhouse. The watch officer had nothing new to report. I was tempted to raise the periscope and look around. I gave the order, personnel on watch for night operations. My eyes began to adjust to the darkness. I gave a new order, diving depth 18 meters. The boat speed was increased to 3 knots. When the boat reached the appropriate depth, I ordered the night periscope to be raised to a low altitude and took a quick look around. The visibility was much better, and it was possible to see the horizon. The moon was already high and in the eastern part of the sky. Its light was quite sufficient for a night attack. Slowly raising the periscope to a greater height, I took 2 or 3 careful looks around but found nothing, and decided to surface. I gave the order, "Get the radar stations ready." The antenna was raised to the surface. No aviation was detected in the air. The radar operator had once undergone a special training course, so his skill was higher than usual. Having decided that there was no aircraft in the air, I decided to surface and go in search of the enemy. Following this, I gave the order, "Stand by, prepare to surface." The bell rang and the crew began to scatter to their places. The boat instantly came to life. A minute later, I received a report that the personnel took their places according to the combat schedule. Another order followed: surface, blow out the main ballast tanks. High-pressure air began to flow into the tanks, squeezing the water out of them. and the boat quickly surfaced. As soon as the upper deck was above water, the order was given to open the deckhouse hatch. The signalman, who had been waiting for this order, opened the hatch and climbed out on the bridge, followed by the navigator. In the meantime, I was observing through the night periscope. The radar station for detecting surface targets was also ready for action. When fresh air began to enter the boat, we stopped blowing the tanks and switched to pumping out water with pumps. This was done to conserve the high-pressure air supply. At this time, the navigator shouted course angle 90 deg starboard. Presumably an enemy ship, I lowered the periscope and, quickly ascending to the bridge, pointed my binoculars in the direction indicated by the navigator. A black spot was clearly visible on the horizon in the moonlight. This was followed by my order immediate dive. At this order, the 4 men on the bridge quickly went down the gangway. The last one was the signalman, who closed the hatch and reported immediately. I fixed my eyes on the periscope, which showed a dark outline. I gave a new order, open the ventilation valves. Water began to fill the tanks, and the boat began to sink. I kept my eyes on the target so as not to lose sight of it. Soon the boat was submerged. These actions were so routine for us that everything went smoothly. As soon as the boat was fully submerged, I gave the orders, ship in sight, torpedo apparatus ready for firing, torpedo drivers prepare to fire. This was at 23:08. After the dive, we turned somewhat to the left, and the outline of the ship was directly across the bow. I continued to watch the target through the periscope, looking over the horizon from time to time, but nothing else was visible. Gradually, the enemy drew nearer. The boat was by this time ready to fire 6 torpedoes. The enemy continued to follow a course that led him straight toward us. Or perhaps it was a destroyer squadron, which had already discovered us and was about to make an attack. It would be hard to hit it with a torpedo unless the ship changed course. I experienced a few anxious seconds thinking that the oncoming ship was a destroyer. In the gloom of the deckhouse, one could not see the complexion of the men in it, and if one could feel the commander's excitement, one could determine it by his voice. We could not accurately determine the distance to the enemy, because we did not yet know the class of the ship. We could not yet hear with the help of noise detectors the noise of its propellers. The round, dark outline gradually turned into a triangle. At 23:09 hours and 09 minutes. I gave the command, we'll fire a salvo of 6 torpedoes at the same time. The order was given to the driver of Torpedo No. 6 to take his place, and the driver of Torpedo No. 5 to get ready. The enemy ship was gradually increasing in size. If it continued to stay on course, it would pass right over us. It was still difficult to determine the distance, as we could not see the height of his masts. In order to fire torpedoes and hit the target, you need to know the distance, course and speed of the target. The calculations must be made by the commander standing at the periscope. When the target is a merchant ship, course and speed can be determined by following its stern. The distance in this case can be determined by radar. However, in this case the enemy, having detected the boat, may change course before the salvo is fired. If the class of the ship is established, its speed can, of course, be determined by a sounder by the number of evolutions of the machine. Many mistakes could be made in such calculations, and in order to hit the target, it was necessary to minimize them, and the salvo itself to make a fan-shaped. Since the course and speed were changing, the time of the salvo had to be determined in advance, especially difficult to do at night, but in conditions of sufficient moonlight it was easier. The target began to emerge more clearly. We could assume that we were facing a large enemy warship. We could see a large mast. The class of ship was now clear. It was possible to determine the height of the mast. It was 27 meters. It was either a line ship or a heavy cruiser. The distance to the target was reduced to 3,650 meters. A distance of 1830 meters and a starboard heading angle of 45 deg were planned for the salvo. Hydroacoustic reported that the enemy was coming at high speed. At first I believed it, but visual observation showed that the ship's course was not too great, and in calculating I took the speed of 20 knots. I was so busy calculating the attack by conventional torpedoes that I did not even give the order to prepare for the release of human torpedoes. Although their drivers asked me to do so, I decided to use them only if the attack by conventional torpedoes failed. The moon was aft of us, and the enemy's ship was now clearly visible. The 2 stern turrets and the lattice mast were clearly outlined. I took it for a line ship of the Idaho type. The crew of the boat were eagerly awaiting the order for a torpedo salvo. There was dead silence in the boat. In such cases, the eyes of the boat are the commander's periscope and the ears are the noise detectors. Except for the commander, no one could know what was going on up there. The men waited tensely for the next order. Drivers of human torpedoes asked me, "What about the enemy? Where is he? Why do not let us out?" The favourable moment for the salvo was approaching. I changed the course angle to 60 deg and distance to 1370 meters and began to approach for the salvo. Finally, in a loud voice, I commanded apparatus tovsia. Fire torpedoes were fired at an interval of 2 seconds. From the torpedo room reported all torpedoes out, everything is in order. 6 torpedoes, like a fan, ran towards the enemy ship. I quickly looked through the periscope, but nothing suspicious was visible. Directing the boat on a parallel course with the enemy, we impatiently waited for the explosions. Every minute seemed like an eternity. At last 2 columns of water rose at the bow and then at the stern artillery turret on the starboard side of the ship, followed by flashes of bright red flame. Then another column of water rose at no. 2 turret. Explosions seemed to envelop the ship. "Hit, hit," I shouted every time a torpedo hit its target. The crew was dancing with joy. The enemy ship had lost power, but was still afloat. I raised the day periscope and gave the personnel in the deckhouse a chance to see what was happening on the surface. Soon we heard the sound of an explosion, the force of which was much greater than that of the torpedoes. Then came the sound of 3 successive explosions, followed by 6 more. The boat's crew, not realizing what was the matter, shouted attack by depth bombs. I quickly reassured the men by telling them that these were explosions on the ship we had torpedoed, and that there were no other enemy ships in the vicinity. Observing through the periscope, I saw several flashes aboard the ship, but she did not seem to be about to sink yet, so I prepared to fire a second salvo at her. From the torpedo drivers came the plea, "Since the ship is not sinking, send us in." The enemy certainly presented an easy target for them, even though it was dark. What if the ship sank before they even reached their target? Once fired, they were gone forever, so I didn't want to take any chances. It was a shame to ruin them for nothing. Weighing the facts, I decided not to release the human torpedoes this time. There was no hurry, but soon I received a report that the enemy was using sonar. No doubt he was trying to determine the distance to our boat. Realizing that the enemy could detect us, I decided to go deep to reload the torpedo tubes for the second salvo. Having lowered the periscope, I ordered to conduct further observation of the enemy with the help of a noise detector and sonar. As we heard after the war, the ship was on the verge of destruction, but at the time we had doubts about this, because although 3 of our torpedoes hit the target, they could not sink the ship. It was soon reported to me that the sending of enemy sonar signals had stopped. Due to the fact that we were reloading torpedo tubes, the boat had a trim, and therefore it was dangerous to rise to periscope depth. Having finished reloading, we surfaced and raised the periscope, but the enemy was no longer within sight. I directed the boat to the place where I thought the ship might have sunk, but even there I found nothing. More than an hour had elapsed since the ship had been torpedoed, and I was now certain that it had sunk. Having sustained such damage, it could not have gone at high speed, and if it had, it must have been within our sight. I still wanted to have proof of the ship's demise, but it was very difficult to find any wreckage on the surface in the darkness. With a feeling of regret, I steered the boat to the northeast, fearing pursuit by enemy ships or aircraft that might be following in conjunction with the ship we had sunk. After traveling for an hour in a surface position, we submerged in order to prepare for follow-up action. As it later turned out, we had sunk the American heavy cruiser Indianapolis. While the mood of the boat's personnel was excellent, we could do nothing to console the torpedo drivers. One of them was particularly offended. With tears in his eyes, he persisted in asking why they could not be used against so good a target as a line ship. I tried to reassure him by telling him that we would soon meet the enemy's ships again. On July 30th, we celebrated the victory we had won the previous day. For lunch, we had our favorite rice and beans, boiled eels and corned beef. On August 1st, we received orders to proceed in a northerly direction and accordingly changed course. I thought it would be a good idea to make a search, so I decided to go out on the lines of communication Okinawa to Ulithi and then Okinawa to Leyte. At noon we submerged and waited for the enemy, but he did not appear, and so at 3 p.m. we surfaced and proceeded onward. We surfaced and proceeded further north. Before surfacing we listened carefully to the surface and looked through the periscope, but found nothing suspicious. Going above water at a speed of 12 knots, we found on the horizon the mast of some merchant ship, displacement of about 10,000 tons, going in a westerly direction without protection. The distance to it was about 10 miles. Although we increased our speed to 15 knots, the distance to it did not decrease, but gradually increased. Even when we had increased our speed to full, we could not overtake the speeding vessel to get into position to attack her. The moon was setting, so even if we had gotten close to the enemy, we could not count on a successful attack in the night. However, it was possible to catch up with the enemy in the daytime. On the boat I-58 were installed 2-stroke diesel engines of low power. All other boats of our type had the same diesel engines. Ballast was accepted due to lack of weight. It was frustrating to the point of tears to see the technical backwardness of Japan. I remembered the speed of 23 knots that the submarine I-24 had when sailing off Hawaii. On August 2nd, we received a report of our intelligence from the communications center Yawata. The following the intensified work of the enemy's radio stations shows that his large forces are involved in the search for the missing ship. 3 days had passed since the sinking of the Indianapolis, but we did not realize that this intelligence was referring to that fact. After the war, we learned that the commander and 315 crewmen of that ship had been rescued. At that time, I believed that the rescue of the survivors was already over, since the crew had ample time to report the disaster by radio before the ship sank. On August 7th, we heard a radio report of the enormous destruction caused to the city of Hiroshima by the explosion of only one bomb. LT, Nishimura, who usually listened to American radio broadcasts, said it was no ordinary bomb. Personally, I didn't listen to the broadcasts and didn't even try to listen as it worsened my already bad mood. We on the boat were unable to appreciate the situation that had been created. Our duty required us to continue the fight. According to the orders we had received, we had to do everything in our power to inflict the greatest possible losses on the enemy. If I had listened to foreign radio broadcasts, it would have been clear that the bomb dropped on Hiroshima was an atomic bomb. Around March 8, 1944, Dr. Tanaka reported the existence of the atomic bomb to the Diet, and since then we have all dreamed of obtaining this weapon as a means to improve our military affairs. If we had known that the enemy had already manufactured atomic weapons, our morale and fighting spirit would have been greatly reduced. From this point of view, our ignorance may have been for the best. But on the other hand, it is dangerous to fight without knowing about the enemy's new weapons and their capabilities. In other words, senior officers need to listen to the enemy's radio transmissions, but one must have nerves strong enough that any news does not cause alarm. Unfortunately, my nerves were not up to the task. Apparently, when the B-29 bomber took off from Tinian Airfield carrying the atomic bomb for Hiroshima, the crew of the airplane knew about the sinking of the Indianapolis, which had delivered a part of the bomb from the USA to Tinian. The crew of the airplane made the following inscription on this atomic bomb, a gift for the souls of the dead crew members of the Indianapolis. I read about this in March 1949 in a magazine. The article was entitled Atomic Bomber Connection Course for Hiroshima. It said that the atomic bomb was assembled from several component parts. Most of them were delivered by air, but the largest and heaviest part of the bomb was delivered on the heavy cruiser Indianapolis. It had been over 20 days since we left Kure. We had not bathed in a long time. There were no extra changes of linen, and we wore the same thing day and night. There was no water to do the washing and no opportunity to dry the linen. Being and working in dirty and wet clothes inside a boat with lots of electrical equipment was dangerous. After sinking the heavy cruiser Indianapolis, which we mistook for an Idaho-type line ship, the submarine I-58 headed north. On August 9th, an atomic bomb similar to the one that destroyed Hiroshima was dropped on the city of Nagasaki. The devastation inflicted directly on Japan grew rapidly. It was also reported that the Soviet Union was at war with Japan. We were still determined, but what could we do? Despite this, the morale of the I-58 boat personnel was high. On August 10th, while underwater, we detected the presence of a target with our hydroacoustic instrument. Raising the periscope, I saw a destroyer squadron not far away. The drivers of torpedoes, No. 5 and No. 6 were ordered to prepare to release. The distance to the destroyer, which was zigzagging, was about 6,400 meters. During the release of Torpedo No. 6 began to malfunction with its engine, which threw white air bubbles with foam. The sea was calm and the destroyer could detect us, so I ordered the torpedo's engine to stall. Examining the surface of the water through the periscope, I saw that the foam had not disappeared and was still giving away our location to the enemy. In addition, running torpedo engines made a rumbling sound, and I was sure that the enemy detected us by it. Finally, the engine of Torpedo No. 6 stalled. I did not raise the periscope, expecting bursts of depth charges, but time passed and still no attack, so I decided to surface and look around. To my surprise, the destroyer was far away. The distance to it was now about 4,500 meters. The ship had time to move away from us. I must say that with the appearance of human torpedoes, enemy destroyers no longer acted as confidently as before. Meanwhile, the drivers of Torpedoes No. 3 and No. 4 took their places, but soon it turned out that the Torpedo No. 3 was defective. So far we had only managed to fire No. 5 torpedo, which was now moving toward the destroyer. At this moment another destroyer and transport ships showed themselves, so Torpedo No. 4 was fired, which reached its target. After the explosion of this torpedo, the entire enemy convoy became confused. Hearing the sound of another explosion, I saw through the periscope that the first enemy destroyer had disappeared underwater. After praying for the souls of the soldiers who had left us, we surfaced and headed north. That night, while submerged and dodging enemy air attacks, we used the boat's hydroacoustic station to detect a vessel, in all probability a merchant vessel, as the noise of the propellers indicated that it had piston engines. The torpedo drivers were ordered to prepare to launch. We then heard the noises of a destroyer squadron that was quite close to us. From the noise detector data, the merchant ship was of large size, but because of the darkness we could do nothing. Oh, if only the moon would shine. The noise of the approaching destroyer was increasing. I decided to turn the boat directly toward it and observe silence. The destroyer seemed to begin to turn to the right, and with it we turned, in preparation for the explosions of depth bombs. Then the noise of the ship began to come from all sides. The enemy seemed to have discovered us and was now passing over the boat itself. Expecting an attack, everything in the boat froze. However, the bursting of depth bombs did not follow, and the crisis passed. On August 12th, the sea was calm. Following northward at a speed of 12 knots, we intercepted enemy radar signals to detect surface targets. We increased speed, intending to reach a position convenient for attack. The enemy radar station's signals continued to come in. After 15 minutes, we saw the ship's mast and made an emergency dive. It happened at 17 hours, 16 minutes. I gave the order to the torpedo drivers and torpedo boat drivers to prepare for the attack. The target was approaching, and I gave a new order torpedo driver, No. 3, to take his place and prepare to fire at 17 HRS, 47 min. I recognized the enemy vessel. It was an air transport, displacement of 15,000 tons. Soon Torpedo No. 3 was ready for release, and its driver on my order rushed towards the enemy. When after the release of the torpedo I looked through the periscope, I saw that ahead of the air transport was also followed by a destroyer. Some more time passed, and the transport continued in the same direction. I saw puffs of black smoke billowing from its pipes. The enemy, evidently having detected the human torpedo, was moving away from it at full speed. I saw clearly how the transport, gaining speed, zigzagged. Half an hour passed, and then I heard the sound of an explosion. Was it the explosion of a torpedo hitting its target? But the first explosion was followed by 10 more. It became clear that the destroyer was on a reverse course and began attacking with depth charges. I was very anxious, my hands were sweating. At 18 hours, 42 min, a great column of water and clouds of smoke rose to the sky. I involuntarily whispered a prayer. Then came the sound of an explosion. When the column of water settled and the smoke cleared, there was no more transport on the surface. Only a destroyer squadron was visible, rushing to the place where the transport was lost. Each of us had feelings of triumph and relief. We prayed for the happiness of our fallen soldiers in their afterlife, then in the darkness surfaced and continued our journey northward. After traveling this course for several days, we came to a point 300 miles from Okinawa Island. Okinawa. We reported our successes by human torpedoes after each victory, when the boat was at a safe distance from the enemy. Due to the fact that the torpedo driver, going to the target at a speed of 30 knots, could use a periscope, hitting the target was not very difficult. If even a human torpedo was detected at quite a distance, it was impossible for a ship with a speed of less than 20 knots to get away. Was it necessary to waste human lives to control these torpedoes? Good results can be achieved by controlling them by radio, but it was too late for us to introduce these improvements. Our situation was truly dire. We were left with only 4 large submarines and 8 obsolete boats, each of which could take only 2-man torpedoes. On the evening of August 15th, the submarine I-58 followed in a surface position in search of the enemy. The search area stretched directly from Okinawa Island to the Strait of Buchanan, Okinawa Island to Bungo Strait. The mood of the boat's crew was upbeat. I was standing on the bridge, surveying the horizon in the direction of the setting sun. Suddenly I was beckoned to the hatch by the chief radio operator. I don't think I've ever seen a sadder expression on his face than the one he had at that moment. He was ready to burst into tears. "Please come downstairs for a moment," he asked me. I reluctantly followed him. Once downstairs, he pulled me back to a corner of the wardroom and said, "Look what I received on the radio." It was the communique of the end of hostilities. I was stunned, but after a short reflection I decided that it might have been a newspaper stunt rather than an official announcement. Mastering myself, I said to the radio operator, "This could have been a radio transmission for the purpose of disinformation. Destroy the radiogram." One of the officers standing nearby, who was always interested in enemy radio transmissions, remarked, "If it is disinformation, it is very clever." I announced to the boat's crew that we could not make a decision to withdraw from the war based on press radio transmissions. In the absence of an official order, we would continue to fight. I ordered the radio operator to bring me all telegrams as they came in draft form and reassured him that no one else would be privy to their contents. So I decided not to communicate anything to the personnel of the boat about the impending events, even if it was an official order. Being at sea, there should not have been any weakening of the firmly established order. On a submarine, the mistake of one man of the crew in the performance of his duties while submerged or surfaced was more to be feared than that of the enemy. One mistake could easily lead to an accident. I therefore resolved to let the crew continue to do their duty quietly and in a cheerful mood until we reached our own waters, where we would have no further need to dive. Talking to the doctor, I was greatly embarrassed by his question, "Won't we hear something unexpected when we get back to base?" All along our route, evading the enemy, we continued to dive and surface, that is, we kept our guard up. On August 17th, 1945, we returned to the manned torpedo base. I noticed a gunboat coming in our direction. Finally, the last moment came and the command was sounded, all personnel to line up on the aft superstructure the crew assembled, and with tears in my eyes I read the Emperor's manifesto announcing the end of the war. Then, without saying a word to anyone, I, together with the messenger who had delivered the manifesto, transferred to the boat and went ashore to report to the senior chief regarding the heroic deeds of our remarkable soldiers, the torpedo drivers. They did not live to see the day of our humiliation associated with our defeat in the war. On August 18th, 1945, we, along with 6 submarines, headed for Kure. Most of us did not enter into a discussion on ending the war, but there were some who were in favor of continuing the war. Nevertheless, it was already over, although some could not reconcile themselves to that fact. As we made our tedious passage to our shores, some pilots, expressing their opposition to the end of hostilities, dropped leaflets urging us to continue the struggle. We, however, in compliance with the constitution of our country, laid down our arms in accordance with the Emperor's order. Let the spirit of the 80 fallen soldiers, torpedo drivers and ultra-small submarine drivers be a testimony to this. Our country will follow the difficult path. The ordeal endured by our nation by the will of heaven continues. Prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor by our aircraft based on the aircraft carriers of the task force under Vice Admiral Nagumo, Japanese submarines took up positions off Oahu Island and saddled the American lines of communication linking Hawaii with U.S. ports on the continent. In addition, preparations were finalized to send 5 ultra-small submarines to Pearl Harbor with the task of striking ships at that base. Between November 18th to 20th, 1941, 27 submarines of the newest types selected from the United Fleet under the command of Vice Admiral Shimizu left Kure and Yokosuka. After replenishing fuel and food supplies in the Marshall Islands, they headed forward as the vanguard of Admiral Nagumo's strike force. Submarines were to sink enemy ships, which would be able to avoid the strikes of our aircraft, as well as to prevent the delivery of reinforcements and supplies from the United States, and thus contribute to the completion of operations in Hawaii. Headquarters in Tokyo expected that a prolonged submarine action will give more significant results than a single airstrike. In reality, the results were quite different. For the entire operation, only one submarine out of 27 managed to go out to attack the enemy ship. Morrison in his work writes the following on this issue. Active patrolling and depth bombing conducted by destroyers and other ships nullified the attempts of large Japanese boats' displacement of 1,900 tons to attack our ships. They failed to torpedo any of the many ships and vessels that came to and from Pearl Harbor and Honolulu. Most of the 20 Type I submarines that were south of is Oahu headed back to Japan after a few days. About 5 boats were sent to the west coast of the United States. One of them, I-170, was sunk on the crossing by an airplane from the aircraft carrier Enterprise. The rest off the coast of California and Oregon managed to sink several of our ships. So the Vanguard Expeditionary Force was a complete failure. It did not manage to sink a single ship. It itself lost 1 large and 5 ultra-small submarines. When the boats returned to base after the operation, both detachment commanders and submarine commanders reported the following. Hawaii's defenses are very strong and the enemy ships are fairly well guarded. All this made it impossible for submarines to carry out a blockade of the islands or cut the lines of communication. Enemy anti-submarine ships and aircraft continuously patrol in the area, and despite the fact that our submarines detected targets, before they could go out to attack, they themselves were attacked by the enemy. The submarine is a weapon of destruction for merchant ships, that is, its main purpose is to disrupt commerce. Both Imperial and United Fleet headquarters of Japan were greatly affected and bitterly disappointed by the negligible results of the submarine operations off Hawaii, with the result that faith in their submarines was shaken. At the conclusion of the Washington Treaty of 1922, we were unable to achieve the desired ratio of the US and Japanese navies, but we believed that this deficiency could be compensated for by submarine warfare. Thus, a new tactic characteristic of the Japanese war of attrition was introduced, i.e., the use of submarines to intercept US fleet ships on their passage across the Pacific to the Hawaiian Islands. The use of this tactic was expected to yield great results. It found a strong supporter in the person of Admiral Suetsuge, who argued that the success or failure of this tactic would be the turning point in a decisive battle between the two fleets, and insisted on preparing for a ruthless war to the end. In other countries, the primary purpose of submarines was to strike merchant ships and disrupt commerce, and attacking warships was a secondary objective. Such tactics allowed for fuller utilization of the submarine's features, as sinking important enemy cargoes was considered paramount. In addition, submarine attacks on enemy ships with strong guards are usually associated with great risk. In Japan, however, the idea of striking heavily guarded enemy ships took precedence over all others, and increased training was directed toward practicing these very tasks. As a result, there were often unfortunate cases when submarines were killed during maneuvers in peacetime. Despite this, the command of the Japanese Navy continued to hatch plans to use submarines in strikes against enemy ships with a strong guard. Indeed, it was felt extraordinary art, which our submariners have achieved, going out to attack in the practice of training tasks and maneuvers. Under such circumstances, the Japanese command expected much from their submarines, and at the same time significantly underestimated the capabilities of the American submarine fleet. As shown by the operation of our submarines in Hawaii, their attacks against warships did not reach the goal, and only in subsequent attacks against merchant ships, our boats managed to achieve something. At the same time, we suffered heavy losses from American submarines, and it is no exaggeration to say that American submarines dealt Japan a fatal blow. To illustrate this conclusion is characterized by the following statement of the Chief of Naval Operations of the U.S. Navy, Fleet Admiral E. King. American submarines played a major role in the overall victory over Japan. 63% of the sunk Japanese ships and vessels of displacement over 1,000 tons each were sunk by submarines. The remaining 37% fall to the share of other weapons. estimated Japanese losses in tonnage, according to estimates of the Japanese command, should have been in the first year of the war 1 million tons and in subsequent years 800,000 tons annually. However, the actual losses amounted to, in the first year of the war, 1,250,000 tons, in the second year 2,560,000 tons, and in the third year 3,480,000 tons, that is 4 times more than in the given calculation data. How did it happen that the Japanese command made such a miscalculation in the estimated losses of its tonnage? It happened because it underestimated the capabilities of the American submarine fleet. When calculating losses, it was natural to assume that the largest share of them will be caused by the actions of American submarines. However, most of the sea lanes connecting Japan with the areas of natural wealth of the South Seas, including the islands of Ryukyu, Formosa, the Philippines, Borneo, Celebes, Java, Sumatra, were protected by a series of natural barriers. We thought, therefore, that we could repel enemy submarine attacks with anti-submarine defenses set up in the comparatively narrow passages between these islands. In the first year of the war, our losses were great due to the fact that we were conducting offensive operations in the south, and our anti-submarine activities had not yet been properly developed. After the second year of the war, we could hope to reduce our losses because our anti-submarine defenses were already established, but American submarines continued to sink Japanese ships. Dr. Jerome Bernard Cohen wrote, "The blockade of Japan by the Americans has greatly intensified, with the result that the supply of raw materials has ceased and military production has been effectively suspended even before the strategic bombardment of the country has begun. Because of this, Japan was unable to continue the war. For every ton of merchant marine built, Japan lost 3 tons, which led to the virtual destruction of the merchant marine. It was a misfortune for Japan to be dependent on the importation of raw materials. The situation was worsening day by day. The loss of merchant tonnage reduced the import of raw materials, because of which the production of steel was also significantly reduced. This in turn affected the shipbuilding industry, making Japan unable to make up for the loss of the merchant fleet. Japan's economy began to suffocate. At the beginning of 1945, the country was on the verge of disaster, and air raids completed the matter. What was the reason for such pathetic results of Japanese submarines? American submarines were not limited to striking only merchant ships. The enemy's boats managed quite skillfully and successfully attacked and our warships. Our losses were enormous. June 15, 1944, having learned that the American forces landed on Saipan, the commander of the United Fleet, Admiral Toyoda, concentrated all available forces to launch a decisive counterattack on the enemy to disrupt his plans. At dawn on June 18th, one of the operational formations under Vice Admiral Ozawa began searching for the enemy. In the afternoon of the same day, to the west of Saipan Connection, found 3 groups of American ships, which included 6 aircraft carriers. In view of the fact that the night was approaching and the distance to the enemy ships was significant, Admiral Ozawa postponed the attack until the next day. June 19th, newly discovered operational connection of the enemy, consisting of 4 groups, was attacked twice by our aircraft. Admiral Ozawa's flagship, the heavy aircraft carrier Taiho, after the first attack on the enemy, was torpedoed by an American submarine and 6 hours later, and sank. Almost simultaneously with Taiho, enemy submarine was torpedoed heavy aircraft carrier Shokaku. Despite these losses, Vice Admiral Ozawa wanted to launch a 3rd airstrike against the enemy, but he had less than 100 planes left at his disposal, and so he had to withdraw to the west to resume attacks the next morning. On the afternoon of June 20th, about 300 enemy planes attacked our ships. The attack hit the aircraft carrier Zuikaku with several bombs, and the aircraft carrier Hitaka was first hit by a torpedo dropped by a torpedo troop. Thus, Admiral Ozawa's task force was attacked by enemy submarines at the moment of repulsing an air attack, and although the aircraft carriers were heavily guarded by destroyer squadrons, the American submarines had no difficulty penetrating through the line of guard and made an attack on our large ships. In October 1944, Admiral Kurita's fleet intended to penetrate Leyte Gulf in order to launch a series of strikes against the enemy. On October 23rd, while searching for an entrance to Palawan Strait, the flagship cruiser Otago and cruiser Nashi was sunk by an American submarine. This represented another major loss to the Japanese Navy. In many cases, American submarines attacked even our anti-submarine ships. What can explain such deplorable results for us? Basically, they can be explained by the low quality of armament of our ships and the imperfection of their designs. Our submarines were poorly armed. They were counterattacked by the enemy even before they approached their targets, or the target eluded them. At the same time, well-armed and well-equipped enemy submarines operated with near impunity, and our ships could neither counterattack nor evade their attacks. Many of our ships became aware of the presence of enemy submarines only when they themselves were attacked. In the field of large submarine construction, Japan belonged to the leading place among the navies of the whole world. Japan built submarines Type I displacement of 2,000 tons, while the US and England had submarines displacement of 1,500 tons. In addition, during the war, Japan built several aircraft carrier submarines with a displacement of 3,500 tons. 6 times Japanese Type I submarines made trips to Germany and, while in the secret German submarine base Lorient, were examined in detail by German submarine specialists. The Germans criticized our boats, pointing to excessive hull vibration, excessive underwater communications, etc. The submarine I-39, commanded by Captain 3rd Rank Kinashi, returning from Germany, was sunk in the Strait of Formosa by an American submarine solely because it had radar equipment of poor quality, although Kinashi noticed upon arrival in Singapore that it had been greatly improved. After learning of the many shortcomings of Japanese submarines, Hitler gave Japan 2 German boats as models. One with a German crew arrived in Kure in July 1943. The other, with a Japanese crew, was sunk by Allied aircraft in the Atlantic Ocean on passage to Japan. The above German boats of 750 tons displacement each were of little value to Japan. The Japanese Naval Command expected much from its submarines. For this reason, both officers and sailors were carefully selected and underwent a very intense combat training program. They considered themselves the best trained submariners in the world. But when the war came with its trials, the results were most deplorable. At the end of the war, the quality of radar and other electronic equipment in the Japanese submarine fleet improved somewhat,